Greetings, gents, and welcome to a pretty quick episode 10 of Econoclasm. I'm recording this right now at 2:30 a.m. I put out the last episode about 6 hours ago, but given the recent events in Syria, I don't want to wait to put this episode out, so I'll just make it now. I always imagined I would at some point talk about the Syrian civil war, but I thought it was going to be more of a retrospective look at how occasionally the good guys can win a war. Because if we look at most of the history, they usually don't. Although, the good guys won the war in Afghanistan, so it's not a complete sweep for the bad guys. But sadly, it looks like the good guys have lost once again in Syria. I'm looking up at the Syrian flag that I have up in my bedroom that I've had hanging in every room I've had since 2016. I realize it's the last day that Syria will be represented by that flag. Now they're going to add a third star and change the red stripe to that vomit green color. Vomit being the appropriate reaction to the news coming out of Syria today. But I realize many people may not understand why Bashar al-Assad was the good guy in Syria, and exactly why his now loss in the civil war is a bad thing. In a region full of religious zealot governments who are hostile to religious and ethnic minorities within their countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE. Bashar al-Assad was a secular leader, which means he didn't involve his religion in his government, which is something the left should love. And he recognized the importance of the religious and ethnic minorities in Syria who had been part of Syria long, long before the current borders or government of Syria existed. In an area where Christians are frequently under threat by either governments or militant groups, Christians were rather safe in Syria under Bashar al-Assad, who protected them. He even built churches for the Christians, even though he himself is an all-white Muslim. There's a quote by Assad about Christians in Syria. Quote, "Christians are not guest or migrating birds. They are from the origins of the nation, and without them there is no Syria." End quote. Can you imagine any member of the Saudi royal family saying that? Benjamin Netanyahu saying that? Erdogan, however you say that little gremlin. No, gremlin's not the right word. He looks more like like if you squished a goblin. That feels like an accurate way to describe the president of Turkey. Could you imagine them saying something like that for Christians? Because I sure couldn't. And, as we prepare to celebrate the birth of Christ here in a few weeks, 2.5. We are now faced with the loss of probably the single best guardian of Christians in the Middle East. You know, a lot of people will say, well, Israel. You know, the nation who will throw you out if you are caught trying to spread the gospel. And, you know, that information is coming from a very pro-Israel friend of mine who goes to Israel to spread the gospel. So it's definitely not an anti-Israel biased source that says that. That's just the way things are. Or, you know, a country where they consider spitting on Christians an important pastime of their country. Or when Assad retook Aleppo in the civil war shortly before Christmas, and the people of Aleppo were celebrating Christmas in their newly liberated city from Islamic terrorists. Who was dropping bombs on Christmas celebrations in Aleppo? Oh, Israeli warplanes. So, I don't want to hear anything about Israel being the guardian of Christians. No. Christians all across Syria knew Assad was their ally. I remember there was a petition of Syrian Christians to the United States to get them to stop supporting the rebels because they needed Assad to stay to protect them. But now Assad is gone. And this has larger ramifications. The only real border buffer left against Israel, and their targets of Christians, you know, even though that border got pushed back by the great President Trump, who gave Israel the Golan Heights. Anyone who says Trump's against the Jews is ridiculous. He's the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish president we've ever had. Maybe after Truman. But certainly, I mean, obviously Palestine, yes. But Israel runs an apartheid state over Palestine anyway. Egypt got bribed off. The Saudis and Israel are both in bed with Satan, so that's not going to do anything. Jordan is, you know, too friendly. And then you got Lebanon with Hezbollah, who is basically the last bastion in the region who is a real safeguard of Christians. I mean, there's the PLO, who, by the way, was founded in part by a Christian. You can look him up, George Habash. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian. But without Assad to assist Hezbollah, that puts Hezbollah in a much worse position. And it just makes it more likely that Israel could, you know, invade southern Lebanon and kill however many countless Christians there in the war. Hezbollah, too, has been a big guardian of Christians. Believe me, if you'll hear from Christians themselves in Lebanon, they are quite fond of Hezbollah, even though, again, Hezbollah is an Islamic party. No, they're not a terrorist organization. There are actually Christian units within Hezbollah. So, Hezbollah, you know, obviously party of God in Arabic, but party of Allah. But they still allow Christians to serve because Christians are an important part of Lebanon and protecting Lebanon and the people of Lebanon, which is, I want to say it's like 40% Christian, That might have changed recently. Okay, so it's about 30% Christian, but still. I believe it's the country in the Middle East with the largest percentage of Christian population. But without Assad there, Hezbollah doesn't have their ally on their border who can help protect them, fund them, arm them against Israeli invasions. And so that's going to weaken Hezbollah's protection of Christians in Lebanon and across the region. So now being a Christian in the Middle East has just gotten way more dangerous with the loss of Assad and his regime in Syria. So for those of you listening who are Christian, I definitely advise you to pray for the Christians in Syria and Lebanon and in the region as a whole, because they are now in much greater danger. Now the Islamist terrorists have taken control of Syria. Yes, that is the Free Syrian Army. They're chock full of genuine terrorists that were well backed by the United States. John McCain was a big fan of them too. So glad he's dead. I should tweet the picture of Megan crying at his casket to her. Apparently the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire does that every year on his death, which is fantastic, but, you know, just in case that little warmonger is happy, just remind her. But all these groups within the Free Syrian Army, I'm sure not every single one of them is an Islamist terrorist, because people will harp on me for saying that, for not clarifying. Oh, well, there's one person in there who isn't, so that defeats... Okay. You got the Al-Nusra Front, which was basically a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. So... Oh, another thing I forgot to mention is you can find Assad paying respect to the victims of the Holodomor, you know, Christians murdered by the communists. Read Alexander Story-Netson to see exactly what motivated that genocide. Only a few years before the Holocaust, by the way. No one talks about the Holodomor, even though more Christians were killed in it than Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And never forget that about several million Christians were also killed in the Holocaust, but never hear about them. But there's an image of Bashar al-Assad placing flowers at the memorial to the victims of the Holodomor. Never seen Netanyahu, the Saudis, any of the U.S. allies in the region do anything like that. No, because they all hate Christians, which makes them perfect ally for the United States government. But anyway, Free Syrian Army, full of radical Islamists. You had ISIS that, Assad was fighting for so long. And I know, Trump likes to champion that he defeated ISIS. No, it was the Syrian military with help from the Russian Air Force. You know what the U.S. Air Force was doing at the time? They were bombing the Syrian army and providing air cover. They were essentially the Air Force of ISIS in Syria. So, this was going back as far as, 2000... When did ISIS first come out? 2011, 12, 13, 14. So unless you're one of the people who thinks 9/11 was an inside job, then less than 10 years, a little over 10 years after 9/11, when Al-Qaeda hijacked the airlines, took down the World Trade Center, the United States government was playing the Air Force to an al-Qaeda splinter group in ISIS, and funding, arming, and training legitimate members of al-Qaeda in the Free Syrian Army. It's a picture of John McCain with multiple members of the Syrian rebels who are also members of al-Qaeda. So, a little over a decade after 9/11, the United States government is now siding with al-Qaeda. Fantastic work against Bashar al-Assad. While the United States was conducting the war on terror by committing mass terror over in Afghanistan, they were funding the terrorists in Syria against a secular leader who protected Christians. Oh, but Assad used gas attacks against his own people. If anyone's actually, I'm sure people will, but if anyone's actually still using that claim over a decade after it's been debunked, it's ridiculous. There's never been evidence of Assad using gas attacks. It is completely illogical for Assad to use gas attacks when they claimed he did. Back when Trump was finally getting ready to pull out of Syria, suddenly people were warning about, oh, but if we pull out, Assad's going to gas attack. And Trump says, oh, if he does, I'll stay. And then suddenly, surprise, surprise, there's a gas attack, and now U.S. troops stay in Syria. Huh. Well, that's interesting. Why would Assad quite literally do the dumbest thing he could and do the very thing that kept hostile foreign troops in his country fighting his regime? Made absolutely no sense. But hey, the intelligence agencies said it was him, so we gotta trust them because we saw how great they handled everything with Trump and the Hunter Biden laptop. Yeah, trust the intelligence agencies. Complete lack of intelligence to trust the intelligence agencies in this day and age. Well, really ever, but it's 2024. If you still trust them, you've got a problem. Also interesting that a lot of the very same people who gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iran in the 80s suddenly have a problem with chemical weapons. Oh yeah, it's 30 years later, but these evil Satanists don't suddenly have a change of heart. Not when they're plotting the slaughter of millions of innocent people in various wars for U.S. power. And it's interesting to note that we have evidence going back to as early as 1983 that the CIA wanted to topple the Assad regime in Syria. Now, back then, it was Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, who I'm currently looking at a trading card I have of Hafez. Oh, it's a shame what they're doing to your son. I don't think they have trading cards of Bashar. But they've been wanting to topple the Assad regime. Shortly after 9/11, there was a printed page showing plans of all the regime change the United States wanted to do across the Middle East. Countries that had no involvement in 9/11. Again, unless you believe 9/11 was an inside job. But it's interesting that none of the plans are against the countries who had citizens involved in 9/11, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. And pretty clear evidence that high members of the Saudi government were involved in 9/11, but, they're still a great ally, and we're helping fight a war of genocide against the Houthis. Houthis? Yes. On their behalf over in Yemen. By the way, if you claim humanitarian crisis, but I've never heard you mention Yemen, don't act like you're anything special. But, of course, it's the U.S. and a U.S. ally, starving millions of innocent people in Yemen. So, it's okay, because, it's the U.S. doing it. So, one of the last good leaders of this world is now gone. Credit to my friend Lesser Josh for bringing this to my attention. Not just me specifically, but posted about it, so this is where I heard it from. The CIA apparently hacked into, Assad's emails to try to find info or whatever they could with him, and all they really found was him flirting with his wife. Having a very good, loving marriage with her. Now, I know that may not be super important in terms of political leadership around the country, but there's not many people in the world who, after being married as long as they had, would still have that level of romantic love with each other and still be into their spouse. I'm pretty sure Melania is just a trophy wife for Trump. Obama's married to a dude. Jill Biden's just Joe Biden's just Joe's handler at this point. It's diaper changer. I can't imagine Bibi Netanyahu was even married. Maybe to the jackal. But it does kind of show that Assad's just like a decent person who loves his wife. And we know he cares about the people. There was a thing that came out at the start of the Syrian civil war. It said most of the people are opposed to Assad's handling of the war. I was like, okay, well, they don't like what he's doing. But when you looked into it, they opposed it because he was being too kind to the rebels. Because they were his people. They were his Syrian people. He didn't want to hurt his people. I can't think of any world leader who would think like that. And the Ukrainians have been bombing their people for 8 years prior to the Russian invasion. Fucking in the United States, they're constantly going after, American people for whatever thing. One of Trump's appointments, I think the head of the DEA, it was, arrested a pastor for COVID violations. Fantastic. But the people of Syria didn't like that Assad was being too kind on the rebels because they were Syrians. He didn't want to harm Syrians any more than he had to. You're not going to find that in any other government. If, rebels come up, politicians love their power, and they'll do anything they can, and they'll kill whoever they want for it. But Assad just had to do what he had to do. Despite the fact that he didn't want, I don't know if he even wanted to be leader of Syria. Seems like a guy who wants to love his wife, which I guess now you could say he gets that chance too. But, he wanted to care for the people of Syria and protect his people. Another aspect of this is what I'm sure will be an impending humanitarian and refugee crisis for Europe. Yay, more non-Europeans in Europe, because Europe has to be for everybody. And I'm sure the Civil War will only get worse, because you'll have all these competing factions now within the FSA. The Kurds who decided to abandon Assad after, he was very kind to them. They're going to increase their separatist efforts, I'm sure. So the Civil War is only going to get worse as the various factions fight for power in the new government. Going to have a flood of refugees out of Syria and into Europe. Well, I remember Assad took in millions of refugees as various wars happened around him. But now, one of the last few decent leaders of the world has been overthrown. There's some rumors that he's dead, that a plane he was in was shot down, and if that is, I will be inconsolable and over in my Christmas. But he's gone, at least from power. And you can imagine things will get worse in Syria, worse for Christians. You have another radical Islamic state rise out of whatever happens. So, pray for Syria. Pray for the Christians who are going to suffer there. And fuck you, America, for continuing to make the world a worse place. America, Israel, Saudi Arabia, NATO. Since they all decided to just constantly put pressure on Russia with this Ukraine war, and so Russia had to abandon Assad, and then the Kurds flipped on him. By the way, I'll end with this little tip that I use when it comes to foreign policy. You can't always know in depth about every conflict in the world. Especially more so if you're not someone like me and you actually have a life where, you do things. And you're not just looking at the ongoing conflicts in the world. A little trick I use to figure out who either the good guy or the less bad guy is in a war, because, in most wars, you're not going to have a good side. Shout out U.S. Civil War. But if you want to look for who the lesser of 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, however many sides are in a war, the least bad option, find out who the United States is supporting. Then go to the other guy. That's the good guy. That's the less bad guy. Because you can guarantee, without fail, if the United States is backing someone, they're the bad guy. So, feel free to use that tip whenever you need to. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Pray for Syria. Pray for the Christians. Pray that Assad is alive. Pray that a miracle happens where he can come back into power. If he is dead, pray that he repented of his sins, came to Christ, and his soul can be saved. But just hope that things go well. But things aren't looking good in Syria. So just add it to your prayers. Thanks for listening.